Thank you. Thanks, Amit.
Hi, Noreena. Thank you for joining us. Now, your new book, The Lonely Century, sets out this epidemic of loneliness that was sweeping the world even before COVID-19. Just in a few words, can you tell us how big a problem this really is?
Yes, well, the scale really can't be overstated. In the United Kingdom, for example, 1 in 5 adults said that they were lonely most or all of the time, and that's before the pandemic. 1 in 8 Brits said that they didn't have a single friend that they could rely on. In the United States, people are so lonely that they're renting friends or paying to be cuddled. And of course, the pandemic has made this even worse. We're in the midst of a global loneliness crisis that's affecting not only our mental health, but also our physical health. Loneliness is as bad for us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's also affecting our economy. Loneliness is costing the UK, the National Health Service, over £2 billion a year. And it's also affecting our politics, something I look at in the book, the link between the rise in loneliness and the rise in right-wing populism in recent years. But of course, it's also affecting the workplace, which I know is what you want to talk to me about today.
That's right. We've all been working from, or a lot of us have been working from home for the last 6 months. But even before that, there was this kind of growing feeling of loneliness, kind of among office workers in particular. What do you think has been driving that?
Well, I think it's a number of factors. And you're right, in the United Kingdom, 60% of office workers said that they felt lonely at work before the pandemic. So we shouldn't romanticize the office of old. I think there are a number of factors. Clearly, the open plan office, beloved by many companies, has a part to play here. Not only because I don't know if you've got experience in it working in one yourself, but I know that when I worked in open plan offices, often just to cope with the noise, the distractions, my tactic would be to have noise reducing headphones on my ears, not exactly conducive to chatting and really communicating with your fellow workers, but also because of the panopticon nature, really, of the open plan workplace, where you can't have private conversations. And so your conversations do tend to be more superficial. You tend to self-censor more. They become more performative. And in fact, research that was done by Harvard Business School last year showed that when they studied an office which moved from being a non-open plan office to an open plan office and saw what happened to how people interacted, rather than being more collaborative and more engaged with each other, the ostensible aim of the move. In fact, people were more likely to communicate by email once they'd moved to open plan offices or by some form of messenger rather than speak face to face. With hot desking, as my research has found, even worse, with people who are in the offices where you don't have a desk allocated, feeling even more lonely and isolated and alienated. There was one story that I came across doing my research of Carla, who had to take a month off because she'd unexpectedly had to have an operation. And it took her colleagues 3 weeks to even notice she wasn't there because literally she was moving desk to desk. So it's kind of paradoxically the open plan office playing a really significant role, but also the hours that we work playing a really significant role in how lonely the office had become even before the pandemic. We see that the hours people are working, especially actually professionals, especially educated professionals, have been rising consistently over the past decade. And all that time working not only means that you don't have time to engage with those and be there for those in your non-work life, your friends, your family, your children, your parents. But it also means that your this go, 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 work all hours kind of work mindset also, it turns out, makes your interactions with your colleagues less favorable, because research has shown that the higher your workload, for example, the less civil your emails.
Yeah, and
Um,
we've kind of gone
Yeah.
from one extreme to the other in a way, haven't we? So we've gone from this open plan office that you described, where you can't really get any peace and you can't really talk to your
Mm,
colleagues kind of on a one-to-one level without other people eavesdropping, to almost the complete
mm.
opposite, where we're kind of working from home and we're lonely in a much more physical sense, as well as all the other problems that you described from the kind of open plan office. So do you think remote working has made this problem of loneliness in the workplace worse?
Well, research that was done so before the pandemic on remote working definitely was very clear that remote workers are more prone to loneliness than other workers, and so it's been a kind of recognized problem of remote working, and of course we've seen it in recent months. I think after the initial euphoria and excitement of, oh, I'm working at home, that some people definitely felt, um, that is starting to wane. And in fact, research that was done pre-pandemic of remote workers interestingly found that loneliness, intense loneliness, tended to kick in at about month 9, which is where we're kind of fast approaching. And if you look at studies that have been done since the pandemic on how lonely people are feeling, we're definitely seeing a significant rise in loneliness, especially amongst young people, especially amongst the under 30s. And of course, there are some people for whom remote working is actually a choice, and is something that they're really happy to be doing right now. But for a lot of people are really missing by now the chat at the office. I mean, even if it's relative, even if it was, far from ideal, perhaps. They're missing just being around other people. They're missing those micro exchanges that we know from research into loneliness make a huge difference to how people feel. Just a hello, how are you? Just even a very small, kind of even quite superficial chat makes us feel much more connected to each other. So, I think it's increasingly clear, that people are feeling increasingly lonely. And I'm on the board of Warner Music Group, which is, and I was on a call with fellow board members of big companies, some of the biggest companies on the world. Board members were on this call the other day, and what in the conversation that we were having, what came out really clearly is that the companies that have been doing very regular kind of pulse readings of their employees have been seeing, and this was in America, most of the other companies, they said that over the past month, they've seen a real marked uptick in employees saying that they are now feeling lonely.
Thank you for that. That's fascinating. So we've got time for a few more questions. And don't forget, if you've got questions of your own, please submit them and I'll try and get through as many as I can at the end. So one of the things we talked about a lot at Wired in our pages is kind of about how companies are sort of redesigning the office to encourage physical distancing. I think most people think that kind of the future looks like a hybrid model where you go in maybe 3 days a week, work from home a couple of days a week. But physical distancing, I guess, is the enemy of kind of close human interaction. So how can we redesign offices in a way that keeps people safe from COVID, but doesn't kind of put up barriers for them and enables them to kind of interact with each other in a healthy way?
Well, obviously there's the kind of acute short-term problem of how do you manage a remote workforce, the challenge of which shouldn't be underestimated. But as we look forward, I think one thing is we shouldn't assume that right now is the new normal. I think this is a real thinking error. And as companies are making decisions about their physical footprints and how the office of the future should look like, I think it really is a mistake to assume that no one's going to want to go into the office, or that the age of the office is over. I just don't think that's the case. But when we're thinking about how do we rebuild the office so that people can feel closer and more connected to each other, there are some things that my research have shown really do work. One thing is eating with colleagues. This may sound like a very small thing, but there was fascinating research done with firefighters in the United States. And they showed that firefighting companies who ate together performed twice as well as firefighting companies who didn't. And there was research also done on soldiers platoons of soldiers who ate together performed more effectively than those who didn't. So eating with colleagues, and you can, when you're back in the office, even if you're having to sit socially distanced, even if, maybe there's a space you can do it outside, I think is something really important moving forward. I think we need, and this is really more for the short term, to kind of reinstate the boundaries between work and home. A lot of people right now feel that they're working even longer hours than they were pre the pandemic. And of course, that's taking a toll, not only on their mental health, perhaps, but also on their relationships with family, with friends. And I think that's something that we can do. But loneliness is also about feeling seen, feeling heard. And I think there's a long way companies can go on that front, on including people up and down the organization when it comes to thinking through how to redesign the office, for example. So really co-create that. And more generally, loneliness is about feeling unsupported and uncared for. And I think, again, there's a lot that companies can do on that front. Cisco, for example, recently voted the best company in the world to work for. They have a scheme whereby any employee at any level of the company can nominate another employee who's been particularly kind or helpful or collaborative, and that person then gets a cash reward, anything from $100 to $10,000. And I think incentivizing care and kindness, traits that typically have been undervalued in the workplace, can make a real difference to how lonely or not employees feel.
Now, when we're talking to kind of big businesses, I guess, they're always going to ask you, or maybe the subtext is always, what's the financial benefit of this? What impact is this going to have on my bottom line? Because I can see, building a big canteen and, providing lunch for your workers so they can eat together. But there is like a business case for doing this as well as a kind of employee mental health case.
For sure. And you don't have to provide the food. I mean, people could bring their own food. But yes, so not only is this good to do, because I think mental health will be the next big health and safety issue for corporations, but also because there's a clear economic cost. People who don't have a friend at work, and in the UK, almost 1 in 5 people say that they don't have a single friend at work. People who don't have a friend at work are 7 times less likely to be engaged at work than people who do have a friend. Lonely workers take more sick days, are less motivated, less productive, make more mistakes, are less committed than non-lonely workers. And the less friends you have at work, the more likely you are to quit your job or switch jobs. So there clearly is a business case for making your employees feel much more connected to each other and to you as an employer. This isn't just a matter of ethics, for sure.
On that kind of business side of things, in the book you do a really good job at looking at some of the companies that have sort of sprung up to fill this void that some people have in their lives. You call it the loneliness economy. Can you just talk a bit about some of these companies and what services they're providing to people?
Yes, so what I really tracked over the past few years was how, at the same time as people were getting more lonely and feeling more disconnected from others, an entire economy was emerging, what I call the loneliness economy, to help people feel connected to each other. So at the most micro level, it might have been services to rent a friend, where you can literally rent a friend to keep you company. But at a bigger level, it would be things like the rise pre-pandemic of people going to gigs or escape rooms, or of course co-working or co-living spaces, or tech playing a huge potential role here with the rise in social robots, robots designed to provide care, but also companionship. In Japan, there are kind of very moving stories of elderly women knitting bonnets for their robot carers. And I think once we're out of the pandemic, the social robots are actually seeing a real rise now during the pandemic, of course, in helping elderly people feel more connected. And there's some really encouraging stories of the role that social robots are playing in making people feel less isolated right now. But moving beyond the pandemic, I think there's going to be a huge desire for more ways and more market innovations to help people come together again. Because if we remember, after the 1918 Spanish flu, within just a few years, we had nightclubs, bars, cafes heaving with people in the United States, in Germany, in Europe. And we are creatures of togetherness. We are hardwired to connect. And I think, if anything, the desire for connection is going to be even stronger. History teaches us such. And so I would expect the loneliness economy, ways to reconnect people, to be an even faster growing industry post-pandemic.
Absolutely. So I've got one more question for you, and then we'll go to a couple from the audience. So my question is, we've mostly been talking about office workers, but how has the rise of kind of gig economy services played into this loneliness epidemic?
Considerably. First of all, whilst everyone can be lonely, young, old, rich, poor, male, female, there is a clear link between income and loneliness. The less you earn, the more lonely you are. There's also, and gig economy jobs, obviously do tend to pay relatively low. There's also a link between a sense of powerlessness and feelings of loneliness. And one of the things that's common to many gig economy workers is a sense of lacking agency, kind of limited power. But there's also something that came with the workplace, epitomized maybe by a story that an Uber driver, Hashim, told me, where he compared life as a minicab driver with his current life as an Uber driver. And he said, when I was at the minicab company, there was a physical place where we used to come, and in between jobs we'd hang out there, and there was a microwave, and we'd eat our meals, and we'd see each other there regularly. And if someone was sick, I'd know that they were sick, and I'd give them a call, and we felt like we were part of something, a community. And he said, but now as an Uber driver, I don't know any of my fellow drivers. I can't even communicate with the company apart from by text. There's no place to congregate. And he said, not only do I feel alone, but I know that if I broke down, another Uber driver wouldn't stop and help me out.